Okay, so ordinarily my usual greeting is greetings everyone. It's Bo Spira, the weirdest guy on YouTube and possibly the internet. And initially that was created because it was basically doing what Nick Giannopoulos did with a certain three-letter word that's an acronym for Western Oriental gentleman. That is a racist slur that is used out here towards people of Mediterranean origin, and it was taking that and it was taking the power back and using it against them. And I'm bringing that up because it kind of focuses on what is going on very much with why I made this video. This video is in part a response to Sydney Watson's video about, just to read off to the TV in front of me, entitled TikTok is a Mental Illness Factory and We're in an Epidemic. And I wanted to partly respond on that, but it's got me thinking about a whole heap of different things. Apologies if my eyes go from the camera because my laptop is acting up, and so as you naturally do when you're recording, you tend to look back in the monitor, so you're at least talking to someone just as a natural thing, or at least I do. Unfortunately, because my laptop is acting up, I'm using my phone, which means that because the camera's on top and the screen's there, looking into the camera lens feels a little unnatural because there's no one around, and so occasionally I'm probably going to look back into the screen so it feels like I'm at least talking to someone, even though it's myself. And yes, I know that's never a good sign in terms of mental illness, etc., but it's a calming influence in this case, but I'll try to minimize it. Um, Sydney was talking about how there are a few things going on with TikTok. Firstly, people that were identifying as having a mental illness to try and fit in. And I know there was one character on Glee who dated Artie initially, for example. I think it was Tina was her name, and at some point it came out that she didn't actually have a stutter. She was faking it to try to fit in. There's also the issue of transableism, where, as I understand it, it is a kind of body dysmorphia where someone who doesn't have a disability will identify as having that disability, to the point where I've even heard stories of people who identify as someone being an amputee to the point where they'll actually get a limb amputated. Um, I genuinely recognize this as something that someone does genuinely need help with, because I don't think any of us who've had a disability would ever, in our wildest dreams, go, hey, I want this, please give it to me. I mean, don't get me wrong, we learn to find benefits, to see outside the square, to see ways it's a blessing, but those are ultimately ways to live with what is difficult, and made even more difficult by a society that doesn't want to get it, especially when a disability is invisible. And that's not to say there isn't undiagnosed disability and mental illness. I'm dealing with an undiagnosed situation myself. But I want to touch on this because I think another side of this is that when someone has an invisible disability, things like transableism, things like people pretending to have a disability or a mental illness to fit in just make it that much harder for those of us with invisible disabilities, especially when they're semi-diagnosed or undiagnosed, to fit in. And I know some people are going to be saying, well, how the hell can a disability be semi-diagnosed? It's either diagnosed or it isn't. And unfortunately, where diagnoses are old, where the body of medical knowledge grows over a certain period of time, diagnoses can be a semi-diagnosis. Something that would be diagnosed one way 30 years ago would be diagnosed a completely different way 30 years from now. And that's very much my case. Look, to give my history. And look, there are trolls are going to troll. People are going to attack me, whatever maybe it helps someone else. Maybe it helps someone understand. Maybe they see things in a different way, and so on. And yes, this is rambling, but look, I'm emotional, I'm dysregulated a little bit. It is what it is. I am who I am. So, when I was in kindergarten, and yes, I repeated kindergarten, go ahead, laugh, rub it in, yada yada. My teachers were at a loss. I had the mathematical and linguistic abilities of an 7 or 8 year old, but I had the fine motor coordination of a 3-year-old. And so what happened was, it's I'm not sure whether it was once a year or once a month, but I was regularly seeing specialists whose response was, I don't know. And as I understand it, by the time I was 12, there was a folder this thick of reports from specialists saying it's something we don't know. And I was classed as a special needs student through primary school. And then, of course, you get the fun and games of ignorant teachers like my Year 6 teacher who told my mother, I don't believe a word of it. He's just immature. Mind you, that summed up a lot of my primary school, where a teaching assistant told my mother after I left primary school that my worst bullies had been my teachers. Same as family. Mum's side of the family on the extended side, I would describe the attitudes of many female relatives, where the weak male relatives tended to enable it, as being an action which could best described as trying to discipline the disability out of me. I'd bring up a dream and it'd be shot down. I'd get bullied. I'd get attacked. I'd voice an opinion. I'd get held down. If I dared to speak up, it made it worse. And one of the worst incidences was Mum and Dad couldn't make a family reunion. I think it was when I was 14. I think it was because at that time Dad had had major surgery. If my timeline's right, it could be, it might not be, but I'm pretty sure it was when I was 14. And a younger uncle and his wife, my aunt, took me up there. During the day of the family reunion, accidents happened. I dislocated my foot in a soccer game, had someone accidentally go for a soccer tackle, roll on my foot, knock me back while pinning the foot down. So if a natural foot is sitting like that, my foot was forced to do that. Yes. My aunt, Mum's younger sister, who was a nurse, who took great pleasure in psychologically abusing me for most of my life. I went over to where she was sitting. She was the person who was medically trained in the family. She basically told me to sit there and shut up, refused to do triage. That night I was made to sleep on the floor. And in the morning, when my foot was locked in this place, I discovered I actually dislocated my foot and I had to crack it back into place. So, you get family who doesn't understand. When I was 12 going on 13, for those not in Australia, we have our summer holidays over Christmas, a big 6-week break. Well, it was the 6-week break between me leaving primary school and going into high school. And I had and basically I had been to, during this time, see Dr. Jane Anthony. Dr. Jane Anthony, for those who are in pediatric circles, yes, it's that, Dr. Jane Anthony. For those who aren't, she, as I understand it, she went on a few years later. She's no longer in this role, but she was the head of neurology at the Sydney Children's Hospital, which, for those not in Australia, is a major pediatric hospital. So big level. Like, if it's being said here, it's kind of the equivalent of, Johns Hopkins in the USA, just to put that level of things in there. It's a pretty big deal. I was given an EEG. I think that's where they put the electrodes on your head to check your patterns, and Dr. Jane Anthony said ADD for want of a better category. This was 1991. This was back when the general understanding of autism was Dustin Hoffman's portrayal in Rain Man, the low-functioning person that could never possibly, cope in regular society. They might have one savant trait or a few, but generally there were a lot of developmental delays, etc. attention deficit disorder was barely understood. It wasn't even understood that there was a spectrum or a crossover. Um, a few years later, I saw Dr. Paul Duffy, major pediatric specialist. He and I think it was Dr. Serpentine in Australia led the charge on understanding what ADD was at the time, but that still was pretty primitive. And that he diagnosed me with ADD, but very mild. And unfortunately, that led to a situation where you don't fit the mold. I remember one of my English teachers in year 11. Now, bear in mind, I'd been diagnosed with ADD when I was in year 9. At the time, I was on Ritalin, so I was taking a legally prescribed amphetamine to school. I was on 1.5 tablets. I think 15 milligrams. I think they were 10 milligram tablets every 4 hours. And I even had one teacher saying, "You don't have ADD because you're high functioning. You don't fit that mold." Uh, people have this uncanny valley thing where if you have a disability, you're supposed to be lesser. You're not supposed to be articulate. You're not supposed to be able to have a high IQ, to be highly intelligent, because you're meant to be lesser. You're meant to be defective in their eyes. But yeah, that's out there, and unfortunately, transableism, as bad as that dysmorphia is, and especially people who, decide that they are going to fake having a disability or a mental illness to fit in. And there are going to be some people that will do that. And that may be caused by another condition whatsoever, altogether. But it doesn't change the fact that it just makes it that much harder for those of us with actual diagnosed disabilities or semi-diagnosed disabilities to fit in. And in my case, semi-diagnosed, because nowadays it is understood that ADD and autism are on a spectrum. There is crossover. And so that diagnosis in 1991 from Dr. Jane Anthony wouldn't have been a head-scratching ADD for want of a better category. I wish there was something there. It would have been. He's on the spectrum. He's on the ADD and autism spectrum. Let's look at the crossover. It wouldn't have been a single diagnosis from Dr. Paul Duffy. It would have been a dual diagnosis, which is the norm here, of ADD and autism, as in you're on the spectrum. And unfortunately, it just ties into so many other issues. If it's not the stigmas that you face with invisible disabilities, and that's without even getting to the way that the right pushed the slackers narrative, the far right, like the Daily Telegraph did back in 2014, I think it was, right when Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey removed the Disability Discrimination Commissioner and used that funding to fund a ballet school. Thank you for that, coalition. Nice to know that disabled lives matter. If it's not the right doing that, it's the left, like feminism, through patriarchal dominance theory, operating from a model which can only respond to abuse against persons with a disability by arguing that our mere existence oppresses our abusers into abusing us. And yes, when you have a model that defines all abuse as a manifestation of the oppression of women and the product of male power, where women and girls can only be victims and only men and boys can be perpetrators, that is what you have. You have a model which can only respond to female-perpetrated abuse against men and boys with a disability, like myself, regardless of whether it's rape, regardless of whether it's domestic violence, regardless of whether it's child sexual abuse, regardless of whether it is a female-led, institutionalized child sexual abuse cover-up in a Catholic high school. That is literally the only way it can respond. Because in situations where those of us with a disability who are male and abused by female perpetrators are confronted with by this model, the only party capable of experiencing the oppression of women is the perpetrator. The only party capable of possessing the male power, capable of causing the abuse, is the victim. The only party capable of being recognized as victims by the model, the only way that the perpetrator can be recognized, is as a victim. And the only party that can be recognized as a perpetrator is the victim. And as those of us with a disability, if you look at the wide range of issues, if you look at all of that, we don't have the ability to oppress anyone meaningfully. Either we're low functioning or we have any agency or power or ability kick the crap out of us growing up. So we can't oppress anyone into anything realistically, which means that you're not talking about active oppression, you're talking about passive oppression. It's basically calling us useless eaters. And, there's a theory, horseshoe theory, where you take the extremes of the left and right and they meet. Well, this is a textbook example of it. And when you have a disability that is more invisible, it just makes it that much easier for people to argue that. Because people don't want to see it. They don't want to deal with the uncomfortable reality that someone with a disability doesn't look disabled. And what really makes it difficult is it just reinforces all these boxes on all fronts, whichever way you look at it. Because in my situation, for example, I took myself off Ritalin when I was 19. I couldn't handle the roller coaster because I would get to the point where I would feel it go up and then the crash coming down at 4 hours, and I just couldn't handle it anymore, so I took myself off it and I learned to live with it. But then you go through enough life as someone with an invisible disability, be it workplace bullying, be it domestic violence, be it nearly bashed to death, be it what started out as child abuse continuing on till you're 19, and yes, all of the above happened to me. And then you get to the point when you're about 40, and you can't handle it anymore. You're not at the point where you can make the best of things. You need help. Only the problem is that autism funding runs out either as a kid or in some states when you're 30 in terms of autism diagnoses. No one will and so you're trying to get a re-diagnosis when you're semi-diagnosed. And as we've established, semi-diagnosed, because I can take what the diagnosis was based on the knowledge now and say, well, this is absolutely what the diagnosis would have been. And say I need to see someone to get that diagnosis, to get help put in place. I don't want handouts the rest of my life. What I want is to get the help I need to go, okay, we need to get you in a job which is going to be the right fit for you as someone on the spectrum. Because I don't want to be going through bad job environments where I'm just going to burn out after a year and go, I can't do this anymore. And then I need to spend time to actually recover from, continually being treated like crap for months on end through workplace bullying when I've already got PTSD from 23 years of child abuse, institutional child abuse, and institutional child sexual abuse cover-up, domestic violence, and nearly being bashed to death in the wake of the domestic violence and the child abuse. I want to get things right, but I can't do that without the diagnoses, which the government won't fund. And when you're not in a position when you're able to work properly, you can't get the money together to be able to get the diagnosis, to be able to get the sports in place, to be able to get the right kind of job where you can get the money coming in. And it becomes this vicious cycle. But the problem is that when you're dealing with invisible disabilities made more invisible, people don't see that there is a problem. They just see someone to shut up. And honestly, intersectional feminism just makes it so much worse. Critical race theory makes it so much worse. Because here's the reality. If you look at the Australian Human Rights Council's own discrimination complaint data for 2019 to 2020, and bear in mind, these are only people who speak up. And even going by just people with a disability who are low functioning versus high functioning. People who are low functioning are not going to be as easily able to speak as someone who's able-bodied who's a woman, speaking about sex discrimination, someone who's able-bodied who's a member of the LGBTIQ plus community complaining about homophobic or transphobic discrimination. They're not going to be as easily able to speak as someone who's able-bodied and a person of colour who needs to make a racial discrimination complaint. And so, yeah, I'm sure that the sex discrimination cases are underreported. I'm sure that the race discrimination cases are underreported. But if you're honestly going to tell me that the disability discrimination complaint underreporting is up here compared to, say, the sex and race discrimination, which is here, then I've got oceanfront property to sell you in the middle of the Simpson Desert. Because the reality is that disability discrimination is going to be massively more underreported than race discrimination or sex discrimination in this country. And you can fight over which of those two is more underreported all you like. But I would argue, without a doubt, that disability discrimination way more underreported. And if you're going to say, well, what about women with a disability, members of the LGBTIQ plus community, or people of colour with a disability who need to make sex discrimination or race discrimination cases, well, I would argue that, again, the common factor there is still their disability. It's still a system that doesn't make it easy for people with a disability to speak. Yet, even ignoring all that for 1 minute, if you look at the figures for 2019 to 2020, and this is the Australian Human Rights Council's official report, official discrimination complaint figures, they know that 44% of all persons with a disability, of all discrimination complaints, were disability discrimination complaints. 21% were sex discrimination complaints. 17% were race discrimination complaints. Which means that if you run those numbers, if you divide 44 by 21, 44 by 17, and 44 by 38, which is 21 plus 17, you find that disability discrimination by those tip of the iceberg figures alone is more than twice as prevalent as sex discrimination, more than 2.5 times as prevalent as race discrimination, and more prevalent than race discrimination and sex discrimination combined, which means we can say that ableism is more than twice as prevalent as sexism, more than 2.5 times as prevalent as racism, and more prevalent than sexism and racism combined. Yet, the intersectional feminists, the cultural Marxists, works, whatever you want to call the applied Marxism, even critical race theory. What's their response? Their response is to try and shoehorn and manipulate ableism and disability when it suits them, or treat those of us with a disability who have inconvenient other labels to them, other arbitrary characteristics that are incompatible and inconvenient to their narratives, as living heresies to be burned at the stake. They would pretend that white people cannot be oppressed, including white people with a disability, because of white privilege. They would pretend that men and boys can't be oppressed in society, including men and boys with a disability, because of male privilege. They would even go so far as to say if you are a cishet white male, even a cishet white male with a disability, you can never be oppressed because you are supposedly the ultimate oppressor and ultimately benefiting from privilege. Yet, if I was to use that Marxist logic, I could just as easily argue that able-bodied women of colour are far more privileged and far less able to be oppressed than disabled white males. Now, when you bring that up, they're the first to argue, oh, you're making it a race to the bottom, even though that's exactly what they do, because they're psychopaths and hypocrites. But the reality is that they are contributing to ableism, and worse still, they're contributing to eugenics, because if you're giving ableism a free pass, you're giving a free pass to eugenics, because what lies at the heart of ableism is eugenics. It always has been. But more to the point, it's ironic because these same individuals who are supposedly pro-LGBTIQ+, pro-people of colour, Black Lives Matter, the Rainbow Lobby, etc., in pushing for eugenics, they're pushing for the very eugenics that saw countless members of the LGBTIQ+ community murdered in the Holocaust, which again was eugenics. They're pushing for the very eugenics which lies at the heart of modern racism, which means they're creating space for white supremacism, so they can't even maintain their own narratives. But yet, all of this, to bring it full circle, is further compounded by transableism. It's further compounded by people that want to fit in and think that things like having a stutter or things like acting in a certain way to fit in is okay. because it just makes it harder for the rest of us who have diagnosed or semi-diagnosed or undiagnosed actual disabilities. And what's worse is this is being pushed by a left that is all too ready to let it happen, because all it sees minorities are as pawns to bring about their glorious revolution. And the reality is that if they ever succeed, if you look at Stalin, if you look at Mao, those people won't be the commissars, the people pushing it. They'll either be up against a wall and shot in a makeshift firing squad, or they'll wind up in the gulags, because they are the threat. And anyone who wants to argue otherwise, just look at what happened with the Bolsheviks at the hands of Stalin. The reality is that Sydney's opened up a can of worms with this and scratched the surface, and I'm glad she did. I know this video's dragged on, I know it's rambling, I know I've been dysregulated. But so what? The reality is that we go on about Black Lives Matter, but the reality is that no lives matter until disabled lives matter. Because when disabled lives matter, we're saying no to eugenics, which means we're saying no to every single byproduct of eugenics, which includes white supremacism. It includes social Darwinism and all forms of ethno-nationalism. Because the eugenics justifications simply aren't there. It includes inequality, because at the end of the day, those of us with a disability are the ultimate other. But more to the point, when we say that disabled lives matter, we're saying that we want a society where we recognize human beings' limitations as simply things that we can grow from, things that keep us human, but that it's our potential that as human beings that defines us. I mean, could you imagine someone saying to someone who's got a broken leg, well, you can't walk properly, so we're going to take you out the back and shoot you now? I mean, people would go, what the hell? But that is ableism in a nutshell. You can't do this, so we're going to treat you like you're nothing, like you're a useless eater, like you're the R word, like you're the S word in a society where using the S word or the N or the R word is perfectly fine. But use the N word and you're cancelled. I mean, that's where we're living. And we wonder why we don't make progress with racism. We wonder why we don't make progress with abuse. We wonder why we don't make progress with sexism, homophobia, transphobia, or any other form of bigotry on the planet. How can we make progress with it when both sides of the political spectrum continue to, at the very least, be okay with those of us with a disability being the ultimate other? And this isn't meant to be a pity party. This is meant to be the cold hard truth of, look, if you want to do away with bigotry and hatred and seeing people as less, then it starts with not defining those of us with a disability by our disabilities. I can't remember whether it was Beethoven or Mozart that was deaf. I think it was Beethoven, actually. But imagine if they were never allowed to compose music because someone said, what would a deaf person ever know about music? Imagine how much poorer the world would be. Think about that for a minute. Or if someone said that Stephen Hawking is just useless because he's got a degenerative disease and he's stuck in a wheelchair. Could you imagine how much poorer the world would be? Yet, when we abort those of us with a disability because they're burdens, which, by the way, is essentially calling us useless eaters, or say, would you want to live if you were like that? Which is the same as killing as a kindness. And by the way, those are not only the arguments of a Nazi, those were the two core arguments of the Nazi euthanasia program, which was the very first stage of the Holocaust and responsible for the vast majority of the final solution. Things like creating the gas chambers, sterilization techniques, sterilization laws, experimentation practices, legal foundations for the Nuremberg laws, and so on and so forth. But when you use that argument, when you go out of your way to make those of us with a disability as children, when you should be nurturing and encouraging us, feel small worthless, and useless. Because you see us the way the Nazis did. And yes, if you are seeing us as lesser, as useless leaders, you do see us the way Hitler does. When you encourage abuse against us, or mockery in public, or attacking us and then shutting us down and then deciding you want to destroy us because when we're dysregulated after you've dysregulated us, then you are making the world lesser. You are taking away from our gifts. You are teaching us we are lesser. And when you do that, how much is the world losing? How would you feel if you had a relative that died of cancer, or renal failure, or some horrible disease? And that cure, that treatment could have come from someone with a disability who's high functioning and given enough chance, could have shone. They could have become a prodigy in spite of everything and created that cure. But you or someone you knew went out of your way when they were young to make them small, to destroy them, to break them until they actually broke. And so they never explored that path. They never honed those gifts, and they never created that cure. And they never were able to save your loved one as a result. That's just one example. But it's a very real example. And unfortunately, this is, as I said, just one part of many things that Sydney Watson's opened a can of worms on. And Sydney, if you're watching this, thank you. If anyone has kept watching this, thank you for bearing through. It's been a ramble, but this is how those of us who are high functioning and on the spectrum talk. It's just stream of consciousness. It's just, look, this is how it is. And it's not polished. It's not professional, but it's real. It's real as it should be. And so I'd encourage everyone to really have a think about things from this. Really have a think. How do you regard disability? Is disability something that, regardless of your intention, if you're young enough, you've been going along with because you want to fit in? Is there a dysmorphia which is there? And in and of itself, that is a condition, and that should be given help. That absolutely should be given help, because it's not healthy to want to have a disability when you don't. Take it from someone who has one. It's a gift, but it's also one hell of a curse. You know, whether you're someone who just has an ideological view where you can't or don't want to see those of us with a disability because we would bring your ideology crashing down like a house of cards and you can't bear the thought of being wrong, or it does away with your whole idea of, quote-unquote, being a good person. By the way, good people actually acknowledge when they cause harm, and they own it, and they say, I want to change because it's not right, because I'm hurting others. That's what good people do, rather than someone who simply wants to be a good person. If you're a bureaucrat who's just ticked all these boxes because you never considered the possibility of those of us who are high functioning and diagnosed with ADD, or we can't pick a box now that would absolutely be diagnosed as high functioning autism or high functioning on the spectrum or wherever it is, you know, and haven't allowed funding for it. Think about what you're costing society, because everyone talks about those with a disability being a drain on society. But how much of a drain is a deaf classical musical composer whose work has inspired so many people? Because the reality is that everyone has a net gainer, everyone has some weaknesses and strengths, everyone is going to cost the system at some point in some way. Everyone's going to benefit from it in some way. And you don't get that when you are just seeing people as lesser, as something to get rid of. That's not how you cultivate resources. You don't maximize the productivity of a population by going, these people are in the too hard basket. No. Because you don't know what you're missing out on. And even if You did. Isn't the mark of a truly progressive society how it treats its most vulnerable? So, there are so many issues here, but encourage everyone to have a real think about disability. I'm also going to link to a petition someone started regarding getting the Australian government to medically fund autism diagnoses. Because the reality is that it's something that needs to happen. Because if diagnoses are funded, at least people can get systems put in place so that they're able to become productive and become part of, a productive part of society and give back in ways that people may not have even considered, especially when we're high functioning. And funnily enough, I think this is one time when my usual sign off really is worthwhile, which I'll get to in a minute. But I guess I should say, look, if you found this worthwhile, by all means, hit the like button, hit subscribe. If you think that this is worth sharing, that people need to hear it, please share it. I couldn't hurt. Worst case scenario, what's 35 minutes of your life? I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of bad movies that run 4 times as long as that probably have far less value to them in some ways. So yeah, with all that said, I guess be kind to each other, everyone. Because all of us, every single one of us, really do deserve it.